Hello, I'm Denise Baron. I'm a PhD student at the London School of Economics, and today I'm presenting a paper that I'm working on with my supervisors and my co-authors, Ben Lauderdale and Jennifer Sheehy-Skeffington. It's currently entitled Voters Prefer Candidates Whose Statements Reveal Matching Social Psychological Attitudes. And I want to start out with a couple examples to introduce this study. So when Theresa May she was running on the slogan of strong and stable leadership, or Jeremy Corbyn said that he was for the many, not the few. These political slogans were signaling some social psychological attitudes that are very familiar to political psychologists, such as authoritarianism or egalitarianism. And we wondered, do signals like this from candidates actually impact the way that people vote? And does that impact change based on how different people are in terms of their own social psychological attitudes? So do social psychological signals from candidates conditionally affect vote choice? And even more specifically, does a social psychological attitude signal from a candidate influence vote choice differently for those who are relatively high and those who are relatively low on that attitudinal trait? So this study is looking at both political communication and voting behavior using a discrete choice experiment, which is relatively similar to a conjoint experiment in terms of its logic and its design. Our theoretical foundation is that area of intergroup relations. We applied these theories of intergroup relations to really understand how voters react to candidates' communication. And by intergroup relations, I'm referencing theories around group identities, the importance of group norms, how groups should behave, how they should be structured and organized, and social hierarchies. So not only which group am I a part of, and what do I think of other groups, but how my group should be set up and organized, and also is my group superior to others? Is my group equal with others? And our particular experiment used constructs from social psychology about in-group identification, specifically national identification, national nostalgia or nationalistic nostalgia, ethnocentrism, authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, populist sentiment, and trust in politicians. So it's a fairly long list of constructs that we pulled from, but they're all generally rooted in that sense of intergroup relations, of understanding what group we're a part of, how that group should be defined and how it should be behaved, and who we are in relation to other groups in society. This study contributes to, obviously, the political psychology research around voting behavior and vote choice, specifically because it considers signals from candidates and the reception by voters. It's within that political communication realm, but it's also in the voting behavior realm as well. And it bridges that social psychological understanding of voting behavior with the methodology from political science that allows us to identify causal factors in candidate selection. So it really is fundamentally interdisciplinary. Also, it contributes to evidence of a causal relationship between these types of attitudinal traits, these social psychological attitudes, and vote choice. Many studies just point to the correlation between these two things. So a high level of authoritarianism, for instance, correlating with a high likelihood of voting for a right-wing party. These studies are very common and very consistent in different countries, but they often don't and very rarely do identify a causal relationship between that type of attitudinal trait within a voter and then their vote choice. Of course, there are limitations with any study, and this within this experiment, it really highlights the fact that it's impossible to randomly assign attitudinal traits to experiment participants. We want to know how different people's attitudinal traits that they carry with them and that they use when they're evaluating candidates and when they're voting, how these impact their voting decisions, but it's impossible to randomly assign it to experiment participants. Therefore, the causal role of these types of social psychological attitudes are particularly difficult to study, but it's still really important that we do attempt to study them and that we use new methods to investigate this, because if we want to use them and understand them as more than just predictive summaries of related attitudes, then we need to see if they do in fact have a causal role in these important voting decisions. So moving on to the methods. As I mentioned, this is a discrete choice experiment, which is relatively similar to a conjoint experiment, if you're familiar with those. And our goal was to investigate the relative influence of these attitudinal traits on a voting decision. And this particular design really enables us to consider a couple different things that other experimental designs wouldn't really allow. First of all, it allows us to assess whether or not previously measured attitudinal traits of respondents explain differential reactions to the same statements from candidates. So do people who have different levels of authoritarianism, for instance, react differently to the exact same statement from candidates, and does that change their vote choice? And secondly, which signals are the most influential? So this experimental design, allows us to compare these in relation to the other attitudinal traits that we include in the experiment. So which are the most influential, which are the least influential, which aren't influential at all, in fact. This experiment was conducted in August of 2019 via YouGov, so it was an online experiment presented to an online panel. And we presented this experiment to 1,656 participants. And importantly, these are all drawn from past participants in the British election study. And this study is a longitudinal study which collects different political attitudes. I'm sure many political scientists and social psychologists use this survey quite often. And since they've collected various social psychological attitudes over time from these respondents, we're able to pull from these people to then use these previously measured attitudinal traits within this experiment design, which I'll explain. Each participant responded to 5 ballots, which then gave us over 8,000 total ballots, total vote choices to work with. Here is an example of one of the ballots that they would see. So they're presented with this hypothetical situation, a hypothetical general election, where the traditional parties are not standing candidates in their constituency, and the race is instead between 2 independent candidates. And then the table that they're presented with illustrates a couple statements from each candidate that says that they were made in writing or on social media before standing for elected office. The statements that are listed under each candidate are in fact from the survey items used to measure the attitudinal traits. For instance, let's look at this one here. Schools should not focus on teaching children to obey authority. That's one of the survey items from measuring authoritarianism. And in fact, this is a good example because it shows how we just very minorly modified these to signal either high or low authoritarianism or social dominance orientation or European identification. And we just added not for this to be a low authoritarianism signal. In case you're not familiar with the design of a conjoint experiment or a discrete choice experiment, I should mention that these 6 statements were chosen from a long list of about 75 total statements that included different versions of both high and low versions of the attitudinal trait measurements. So the previous BES, the previous British election study responses were matched the participants' experiment responses. And we were then able to generate interactions with the corresponding treatment variables. So we were able to take this treatment variable of one of the low authoritarianism signals being included in the profile, and then we were able to interact that with the participants' own level of authoritarianism to see whether or not those who are high or low responded differently to being presented with that signal. And in terms of the analysis, we fit an ordered logistic regression model, and our main analysis for this paper compares the coefficients for the interactive treatment terms. So let's move on to the results. First of all, our analysis demonstrates strong, consistent differential treatment effects. So people responded differently to the exact same statements from candidates based on their own level of these social psychological attitudes. Second, participants' attitudinal traits are stable and meaningful. We saw that even though we measured some of these 5 years before our experiment, the BES was collected 5 years before for some of these, as little as 5 months, that these are still meaningful and stable and important determining factors of how people react to these statements from candidates. Lastly, these signals from the candidates are not just proxies for left to right ideology or partisanship. They are, in fact, much more, the reaction to these candidates are shaped much more clearly by the participants' social psychological attitude than by their placement on the left to right spectrum or their past vote. So these plots show us the level of differential, sort of illustrate the differential response. The x-axis are the participants' level of different attitudinal traits, such as European identification, authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, etc. And on the y-axis, we have the estimated treatment effect. And so this illustrates the fact that all of these attitudinal traits were in fact significant influences on vote choice. Voters systematically preferred candidates who matched them and rejected candidates who were opposite to them on these core social psychological attitudes, but to differing levels. I want to focus a little bit more so on the three that were in fact the most influential. And again, this is European identification, social dominance orientation, and authoritarianism. And we can see here that if you are someone who is very low in European identification, you see a candidate signaling high European identification, that's what the solid line is here, then you are much less likely to vote for them. If you're someone who is high in European identification, you see that same exact signal from a candidate, you're much more likely to vote for them. And again, we see this across the board with all of the different factors that we included. There's only one that was slightly not significant, and that was high British identification. I also want to show this illustration of the results. So this graph illustrates the estimated effect of the interactions between candidate statement treatment terms and the participants' corresponding attitudinal trait. Now, this illustration allows us to see these in relation to each other, sort of compare the relative influence of each of the attitudinal traits. And the reason why I really want to illustrate that is because this is how we can tell that they are not actually proxies for right to left ideology or partisanship. So in one model, we included the interactions with the participants' social psychological attitude. And then we also included interactions with those treatment terms with right to left ideology, so where they place themselves on a right to left spectrum, and their past vote. So these results show us how this kind of pattern of differential reaction, so high European identification, low European identification, high authoritarianism, low authoritarianism, high SDO, low SDO. But when we look at left to right, we don't see that same kind of differential bouncing back conditional response. The closest thing we get is with a high European identification, low European identification, nearly significantly being used as proxies for left wing and right wing respectively, but it's not significant, and we don't see that same pattern whatsoever for any of the other items. So what do these results mean for political psychology? First of all, they contribute causal evidence that core social psychological attitudes shape how voters react to candidates who are tapping into these attitudinal traits. It indicates that there is a causal role that these social psychological attitudes play. And in fact, it really emphasizes that orientations towards groups, so our in-group identification, who we are as a group member, and orientations towards hierarchies, so authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, whether or not we think authority should be deferred to, or that our group is superior inherently to others, that these types of group orientations are really important. So since these types of orientations are so important, then we would say that it's important that they're measured in political opinion polling. And lastly, this is the results of this study indicate that there's a new avenue for study of underlying social psychological dynamics that are involved in political messaging. So thank you very much. I, of course, want to give a big thank you to my supervisors and co-authors, Ben Lauderdale and Jennifer Sheehy-Skeffington, and to the organizers of the conference. Thank you for the opportunity to present this.